2 miles from one of the grandest houses in England stands a plain brick farmhouse, 5 bedrooms, and no grandeur at all. But for more than 100 years, this small building has done one quiet job for the richest family in Britain. It is the house where they send the ones who cannot be seen. A sick child kept there until he died. A retired prince living apart at the close of a long public life. And now, in our own time, a disgraced brother moved out past the shooting woods. 3 lives, one small door on the edge of the estate. This is the story of Wood Farm, and of what a great family does with the people it needs to keep from view. If you love the houses that history tried to keep quiet, and the people kept quiet inside them, subscribe now and stay with me, because this small farmhouse has held its secrets for more than 100 years. Chapter 1. A small door on the edge of a great estate. Turn off the road at Sandringham, drive 2 miles past the shooting woods, and you reach a house that was never meant to impress anyone. There are no gates worth the name. There is no long approach lined with limes, no fountain, no facade built to be photographed. There is a farmhouse of red brick, 2 stories high, shaped roughly like the letter L, with a scatter of low outbuildings around it and a view that runs out over the marshes toward the sea. It has 5 bedrooms. It has a kitchen and a sitting room, and beams low enough to make a tall man stoop. It is the kind of house you would drive past in any corner of rural Norfolk without a second glance, and that is the first thing to understand about it. It was built to be overlooked. The house is called Wood Farm, and it sits near the far edge of the Sandringham estate, close to the old railway halt at Wolferton and the ground kept for the pheasant shoots. In a portfolio of palaces, it is the one ordinary dwelling. The family that owns it also owns Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, the 2 most watched addresses in the country, and it keeps this plain brick farmhouse for the days and the years when being watched is the very thing it needs to avoid. Everything about Wood Farm is the opposite of a palace. Where a palace is built to gather a crowd, this house is built to hold no one but a handful of people and to keep them, gently and completely, out of sight. To feel the strangeness of the place, you have to set it against what surrounds it. The Sandringham estate runs to some 20,000 acres of Norfolk, a private kingdom of farm and forest and heath. The great house at its centre, Sandringham House, has held more than 200 rooms in its prime, with a household of servants to match, a ballroom, and guest wings raised for the comfort of kings. 2 miles away, at the end of the track, sits a farmhouse where the same family has been happy to cook its own meals and wash its own dishes, where the staff have long been allowed to work without a uniform, where the whole apparatus of royalty is simply switched off. The distance between the 2 houses is only 2 miles on the map. In every other sense, it is the distance between being seen and disappearing. That distance is the reason the house matters. A great family that lives its life in public has always needed one place where the public cannot follow, and Wood Farm became that place. It is far enough from the big house to be genuinely apart. It is small enough to be run without ceremony, and it stands inside the family's own private land, under the family's own control, watched over by the estate's own people. If you wanted to design a house in which to keep someone quietly, out past the woods, beyond the reach of the crowds and the cameras and the newspapers, you could hardly do better than this. That is precisely what the house has been used for, not once, but again and again, across more than 100 years. The plainness is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Wood Farm has no dark tower and no ruined wing, no ghost walk and no scandalous ballroom. Its power was always a stranger and quieter kind. It was the power to make a person vanish from view while remaining perfectly safe, perfectly cared for, and perfectly hidden. And the people it has hidden could not have been more different from one another. a little boy who could not be shown to the world, an old prince who no longer wished to be, and, in the present day, a man the family needed the world to stop looking at. The same small door opened for each of them. There is a particular kind of power in a house like this, and it is easy to miss because it looks like nothing at all. A palace announces, a farmhouse absorbs. Set a person inside these low rooms, 2 miles from the nearest road that matters, and the world simply loses sight of them. No high wall is needed, no lock, no guard at the gate. The distance does the work, and the plainness finishes it, and the person inside slips quietly out of the public story. That silent power is the thing this house has always held out to the family that owns it. There is a temptation, standing in front of a house like this, to see only the charm of it, the log fire, and the low beams, and the quiet fields. The charm is real. Generations of the family have loved Wood Farm for exactly that plainness, have called it the one place they could stop being royal. But underneath the charm, there is a colder use, older than any of the living family can remember, and it is that colder use this story is about. It began one winter, when the house first took someone in, with a small boy, a devoted nurse, and a king and queen who had decided that their own son could no longer be seen. Before any of that, though, comes the estate itself, and the enormous private fortune that made a hiding place like this possible in the first place. Chapter 2. The estate money bought and kept private. In the spring of 1862, a prince spent a fortune on a stretch of Norfolk, and the family has never let it go since. The prince was Albert Edward, the eldest son of Queen Victoria, the young man who would one day reign as Edward VII. He was barely 20. His family wanted him settled in a country home of his own, well away from London, and a country estate seemed the answer. The estate they found for him was Sandringham, a flat corner of Norfolk with good shooting, and in 1862 it was bought in his name for the sum of £200,000 and more. It was an enormous price for the land itself. What it truly bought was privacy, and privacy for this family would always be worth paying for. The money did not come from the public purse, and this is the single most important fact about Sandringham. Unlike Buckingham Palace, unlike Windsor Castle, which the monarch holds as an institution of the crown, Sandringham was bought as private property, with private money, and it belongs to the sovereign in person to this day. It is not part of the crown estate. It is not the nation's. It is owned exactly as any rich man owns his acres, to keep or to sell as the family chooses. The funds for the purchase came from the revenues of the Duchy of Cornwall, the great landed endowment that pays for the heir to the throne, which had swollen into a large surplus during the prince's boyhood. A childhood spent saving bought a grown prince his private kingdom. The scale of that kingdom is hard to hold in the mind, and it only grew. At the start, the estate ran to close to 6,900 acres. Over the following century and a half, the family bought up the land around it, farm after farm, field after field, until the estate reached its present size of about 20,000 acres. More than half of that land is let out to tenant farmers who pay rent. There are 2 studs for the breeding of horses, a fruit farm, a country park, and shooting let for large sums. This is not a house sitting idle in the countryside. It is a working fortune of land, an engine that has earned its keep quarter by quarter for 160 years, and it belongs to the family absolutely, beyond the reach of Parliament or public. Onto this land, the young Edward built the house he wanted. The plain Georgian building that came with the estate was too small for a prince, and after his marriage to the beautiful Danish princess Alexandra in 1863, he had it pulled about and rebuilt. The new Sandringham house was finished in 1870. A ballroom was added in 1881. Guest wings went up in the 1890s to house the shooting parties that made the place famous across Europe. Here, Edward gathered the fastest and richest society of the age, the set that gambled and shot and dined its way through the long Norfolk weekends. He loved the shooting so much that he set the clocks at Sandringham half an hour ahead of the rest of the country so that the light would last longer into the afternoon. For decades, the estate ran on its own time, and the world came to it. It is worth measuring for a moment the sheer weight of what stood here at its height. An estate of 20,000 acres, a house of more than 200 rooms, a household of dozens of indoor servants, and an army of keepers and grooms and gardeners beyond them. Clocks that ran fast because a king wished them to. Kings and emperors among the guests, the Prince of Wales at the centre of it all, and a fortune underneath that renewed itself every year without a hand being lifted. This was display on the grandest scale the country could offer, a machine built to be seen, to gather the powerful and impress them. And it is the whole point of this story that such a machine, sooner or later, produces something it cannot put on show. For the family that owned Sandringham did not only host kings, it also raised children, and not far from the great house stood a smaller one where those children were brought up. York Cottage was the home of the prince's own son, George, and his wife, Mary, and it was here that most of their children were born and reared. It was a cramped and modest place for a future king, and the family in it lived, by royal standards, plainly. Into that family, in the summer of 1905, a sixth and final child was born. He was a large and healthy-looking boy. For the first years of his life, there was nothing to mark him out from his brothers and his sister, nothing to suggest that he would become the first person this estate would need to hide, and that the house chosen to hide him would be a farmhouse 2 miles away across the fields. Chapter 3. The Child Who Could Not Be Shown. The sixth and youngest child of a king was a big, healthy-looking boy until the seizures began and the doctors began to warn. His name was John Charles Francis, and he was born at York Cottage on the 12th of July, 1905, the last of the 6 children of the man who would reign as King George V and his wife, Mary. When his father became king in 1910, the little boy stood 5th in the line of succession. He was, by the accounts that survive, an affectionate and high-spirited child, quick to laugh, fond of the people who cared for him, the kind of small boy who says exactly what he thinks in front of exactly the wrong people. In an ordinary family, he would have been a handful and a delight. In this family, he was something more difficult. He was a prince, and a prince was expected, above all, to be shown. The trouble came early. From around 1909, when he was 4 years old, John began to suffer seizures. The word used then was epilepsy, and the diagnosis carried a weight it is hard to feel now. There was no effective treatment. There was little understanding of what caused the fits or how to stop them. Alongside the seizures, the boy showed signs of a developmental difficulty, a slowness that set him further apart from his brothers as they grew. For a few more years, he remained part of the visible family, appearing in photographs and at family occasions, a plump and cheerful boy standing with his sister and his brothers. But the doctors watched him and shook their heads. They warned the king and queen that their youngest son was not likely to live to grow up. The reason lies in what a royal childhood was for. Such a life was not private. Every appearance of the sovereign's children carried a meaning, spoke of continuity, of health, of a dynasty sure of itself and its future. The family lived under a gaze that never entirely lifted. A child who might at any moment fall to the ground in a fit, whose mind did not keep pace with his years, was a child who could not safely be placed under that gaze. The pressure to remove him from it was partly practical, for a seizure in public would have been a frightening and pitiable thing, and partly something colder, a matter of the image the family was required to present. In an age that hid such children away as a matter of course, the question was never really whether John would be removed from view. It was only where, and how kindly. The medicine of the time pushed hard in one direction. In the early years of the 20th century, epilepsy was widely regarded as something to be managed by separation. Across Britain and Europe, people with the condition were placed apart from ordinary life in dedicated colonies and institutions, kept away from a society that feared and misunderstood them. This was not a royal cruelty. It was ordinary medical practice, and it would remain so for decades. Seen in that light, what the king and queen did with their son was exactly what thousands of less exalted families were advised to do with theirs. The difference was that this family had somewhere private to put him. It had 20,000 acres, and it had a quiet farmhouse 2 miles from the big house, standing empty at the edge of the fields. There is a cruelty folded into that kind of expectation, and the boy had done nothing whatever to earn it. He had committed no fault beyond being born ill into a family that could not afford, in the hard currency of its own survival, to be seen with a child who was ill. The illness was his to carry. The shame, if shame is the right word for it, belonged entirely to the watching world. As John grew older, the seizures grew worse. By 1916, they had become more frequent and more severe, and the boy who had once appeared in the family photographs appeared in them no longer. The decision took shape gradually, as such decisions do, until it hardened into a plain arrangement. The youngest son of the king would not live at York Cottage with the rest of the family. He would live at Wood Farm, out across the estate, with the people who cared for him, in a house of his own. He would have a garden. He would have chickens. He would have space and quiet and country air. And he would have, above all, distance, the 2 miles of Norfolk that lay between the farm and the world that could no longer be allowed to see him. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to tell this only as a story of cold hearts. The people who made this decision were not monsters, and the years that followed at Wood Farm were, in many ways, gentle ones. But it would be just as wrong to pretend there was nothing painful in it. A young boy was being moved out of his family home because his illness had made him unshowable. Whatever mixture of mercy and management drove it, the result was the same. The little farmhouse at the edge of the estate was about to take in its first hidden occupant, and the woman who went with him would give the rest of her life to him, and would keep his memory long after the family that sent him there had chosen to forget. Chapter 4. A satellite household on an outlying farm. When they moved him, they did not move him alone, and the woman who went with him would keep his memory for the rest of her life. Her name was Charlotte Bill, and to the royal children, she was Lala. She had come into the household years before, and had risen to take charge of the nursery, and she had raised the whole brood of children through their early years. She had nursed the boy who would one day become King George VI. She had a steadiness the family leaned on, and a plainness of heart it did not always deserve. Of all the children, it was the youngest, John, to whom she gave herself most completely. When he went to Wood Farm, she went with him, and she stayed at his side until the very end. What grew up around the boy at Wood Farm was a small world of its own, a household in miniature set 2 miles from the great family it belonged to. One biographer called it a satellite, John living with his own little establishment on an outlying farm. There was Lala at the centre of it. There were the few servants who kept the house. There was the country all around, the woods and the fields and the marsh air, and there was time, long unhurried stretches of it, such as no palace ever allowed. The boy kept chickens. He worked a patch of garden. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, by then the widow of Edward VII and living out her own years at Sandringham, had part of the gardens turned over to a plot that was his to tend, and she came to see him, and she doted on him in the way grandmothers are allowed to dote once the weight of the throne has passed them by. His mother did not forget him either, whatever the later stories would say. Queen Mary arranged for children from the neighbourhood to come to the farm and play with her son, so that he should not be alone in his exile. One of them was a girl named Winifred Thomas, brought to Sandringham partly for her own health, who became his companion in those years. The two of them cycled the lanes together. They played in the woods around the farm. For a boy whose illness had cut him off from his brothers and from the ordinary run of a royal childhood, these were real friendships and real pleasures, and they happened here, in the plain rooms and the green fields of Wood Farm, and nowhere else. The house that had been chosen to hide him became, for a few short years, something gentler than a hiding place. It became somewhere a difficult boy was simply allowed to be a boy. It is worth holding both of these truths at once, because the story only makes sense if you do. Wood Farm was an instrument of concealment. It was also, for the child inside it, a kind of refuge. The same 2 miles of distance that kept him from the world's eyes also kept the world's demands away from him. He did not have to stand still for the camera. He did not have to behave in front of strangers like a prince. He could dig and ride his bicycle and laugh too loudly and fall ill without an audience of courtiers watching to see what it meant for the dynasty. The women around him, his nurse and his grandmother, and, in her distant way, his mother, built a small life for him inside the walls of the hiding place, and by most accounts it was a happy one. Whatever cruelty there was in his story did not live in the daily texture of these Norfolk days. And these were the years of the First World War, which pressed on the whole country and on this family too. Beyond the quiet of the estate, a generation of young men was dying in the mud of France and Belgium, and the austere conditions of those war years shaped what could be done for one sick child in Norfolk. It has been argued that Wood Farm gave the boy the best that could be managed in such a time: a settled home, clean air, a devoted nurse, and the freedom of the fields, when the wider world had turned itself over entirely to the business of war. Whether that was the whole truth, or only the kindest part of it, the farm did give him those things. It gave him a garden in a country digging trenches. It gave him quiet in years of noise. Picture the ordinary shape of his days, because the ordinariness is the whole point of them. A boy wakes in a plain bedroom under a low-beamed ceiling. He goes out to his chickens. He digs in the plot his grandmother made for him. In the afternoon, a friend arrives, and the two of them take their bicycles down the lanes between the fields, and the marsh wind comes in off the sea, and for a few hours there is nothing of the palace in any of it. No bows, no watching faces, no sense of a nation waiting to see what he would become. It was the most nearly ordinary childhood a son of the king could have been given, and it was possible only because it happened out of sight. The very concealment that the cold version of the story condemns was also the thing that bought the boy his freedom. At Wood Farm, he was hidden, and at Wood Farm he was, for a while, simply a happy child. And both of those things were true of the same small house at the same time. Yet the household at Wood Farm lived the whole time under a shadow that never lifted, and everyone in it knew the shape of that shadow. The doctors had been plain from the start. The boy was not expected to reach manhood. Every gentle day in the garden was lived against that knowledge, and the woman who loved him most carried it with her every waking hour. Lala watched the seizures come, more often now and harder, and there was nothing she could do but hold him through them and wait for each one to pass. She could give him affection and routine and the ordinary warmth of a nursery, and she gave all of it without stint or reserve. What she could not give him was time, because time was the single thing the illness had already refused. The little household on the outlying farm was, from its first day to its last, a household quietly waiting for a death. When that death came, it would come here, in these rooms, on a winter evening, and it would empty the house of the only reason it had ever had to exist. Chapter 5. Hidden in shame or kept in care. 100 years later, people would call it heartless, and the people who understood the medicine of the time would call that judgment unfair. The story of Prince John has become, in our own age, a byword for royal coldness, the tale of a sick child bundled out of sight and left to die alone while his family carried on without him. It is a powerful story. It is also not quite a true one, and the argument over it deserves an honest hearing, because the truth sits somewhere in the difficult ground between the two readings, and neither one can simply be waved away. The dark reading reached most people through a single work. In the year 2003, a television drama called The Lost Prince told John's story to a large audience, and it framed his seclusion as an act of shame. A family frightened of its own flawed child, hiding him away in the country and turning its face from him. The drama was moving and beautifully made, and it fixed an image in the public mind that has never quite loosened its hold. In that image, John is a prisoner, Wood Farm is a gentle jail, and the king and queen are cold and distant figures who could not love what they could not perfect. It is the version most people carry when they think of him at all, and it is the version that gives this quiet house its darkest name. Set against it is the reading of those who know the history of the illness itself, and it is a powerful corrective. The plain fact is that in the years around 1916, there was no treatment for epilepsy worth the name, and the standard response to the condition, everywhere in the Western world, was separation. People who suffered from it were routinely placed apart, in colonies and homes built for the purpose, kept away from a society that feared and misread their fits. This was the settled medical wisdom of the day. It was not a peculiar royal cruelty invented for one boy. When the British Epileptic Association looked back on John's case in later years, it made exactly this point. There was nothing unusual, it said, in what the king and queen did. At that time, people with epilepsy were put apart from the rest of the community, and that practice continued for another 20 years after John was gone. Judged against the standards of his own age, the family did no more and no less than countless humbler families were being advised to do with their own. The deepest trap in judging this story is the temptation to carry the knowledge of our own age back into a world that did not possess it. Today, epilepsy is understood, and for very many people, controlled. A child with the condition sits in an ordinary classroom and lives an ordinary life. None of that existed in 1916. There were no reliable medicines, no scans, no real grasp of the thing at all, only fear and folklore, and the settled habit of putting sufferers somewhere apart. To look at what the family did through modern eyes and call it monstrous is to blame the people of the past for failing to know what only the future would learn. That is a comfortable sort of judgment, and it is not a just one. There is a further point that the shame reading tends to hurry past. For most of his life, the boy was not, in truth, kept as some dark secret from the world. In his earlier years, he appeared with the family in public, at the occasions expected of a king's son, until the point at which his illness grew too severe for him to be shown at all. The retreat to Wood Farm was the last stage of a long decline, not a plot laid at his birth to erase him. The family did not hide a healthy child out of embarrassment. It withdrew a gravely ill one from a life he could no longer manage, in the years when he could no longer manage it, in the manner its doctors thought right. Whether that withdrawal was done with a cold heart or a breaking one is the very question that cannot be settled, and honesty means leaving it open. There is also the evidence of the years at the farm themselves, which does not read like abandonment at all. A truly discarded child is not given a devoted nurse who stays to the very end and keeps his memory for another half a century. He is not given playmates fetched to him by his own mother. He is not given a garden made for him by a doting grandmother, or visits, or the plain daily affection that surrounded him at Wood Farm. Queen Mary's own words, written when he died, speak of a mother's grief and not of relief at being rid of a burden. Those are not the marks of a family that had thrown its youngest son away. They are the marks of a family that had placed a very ill child where it believed he would be safest and happiest, in the manner its doctors and its age thought right. So which was it? Shame or care? The honest answer is that it was almost certainly both at once, tangled together in a way that can no longer be pulled cleanly apart. A family can love a child and also be quietly relieved to have his difficulty out of the public eye. A decision can be sound medicine and convenient management in the same breath. The move to Wood Farm can have been, at one and the same time, the kindest arrangement available under the harsh conditions of the war, and a tacit admission that a prince who could not be shown had no place at the centre of a family whose entire life was display. What is not honest is to seize on one reading and pretend the other has no weight. The house holds both, and it always has. And the thing that most looks like shame, the thing that would do John the deepest wrong, did not happen while he lived in these rooms at all. It happened afterwards, in the years after his death, when the family sat down, in effect, to decide how much of him to remember. Chapter 6. The boy his family tried to forget. After the nurse died, they found a note among her belongings, written in a child's hand, and it had outlasted almost everyone who wrote the histories. Charlotte Bill lived on for more than 40 years after the boy she loved was gone. She died in 1964, an old woman of nearly 90. And when her things were gone through after her death, there was a note the boy had written her, in the plain, unguarded words of a child, telling his nanny that he loved her. She had kept it all her life. On her mantelpiece, to the very end, she kept a large photograph of the same small prince, so that one of the last things a visitor to her rooms would see was the face of a boy who had been dead for 45 years. Whatever the family above her chose to forget, the woman who had actually raised him never forgot for a single day. That devotion is the truest measure of what John was to the people who knew him at close hand. He was not to them a burden to be managed and hidden. He was a child who drew love out of people and returned it plainly, without guard or calculation, which is one of the strange mercies of a mind that does not keep pace with the world. He said what he felt. He loved the people who were kind to him. The accounts that survive describe a warm and funny boy, given to blurting out the truths that grown people had silently agreed to leave unspoken, delighting in small things, happiest of all in the open air with a spade in his hand or a bicycle beneath him. To the nurse who raised him and the grandmother who spoiled him, he presented no problem to be solved. He was simply Johnny, and they loved him. Not everyone in the family looked on him so gently, and here the story turns cold once more. His eldest brother Edward, the glamorous Prince of Wales, who would one day briefly wear the crown and then throw it away, wrote of the little boy in terms that were cold and wounding, the careless cruelty of a vain young man about a brother he found an embarrassment to be near. When his words became known within the family, his relatives were appalled by them. There is a whole psychology folded into that single contrast. The brother, who was beautiful and charming and destined for the throne, could look at John and see nothing but a flaw in the family's perfect front. The nurse, who held no rank at all, could look at exactly the same child and see someone worth loving for the rest of her life. The measure of a person, the story seems to whisper, lies in which of those two things they saw when they looked at a boy who could not defend himself. It is one of the quiet ironies of his story that the people history remembers best. The glittering elder brother bound for the throne thought least of him, while the woman history forgot thought of almost nothing else. Rank counted for nothing at all in the matter of love. A future king looked at his youngest brother and felt only embarrassment. A nurse from no family of note looked at the same boy and gave him her whole heart, and went on giving it for 45 years after he was gone. Something in his open nature seems to have disarmed the people who cared for him. A child who cannot mask what he feels forces a kind of honesty on the grown people around him. There was no performance to John, no courtly manner learned by rote, only the plain feeling of a boy who loved and said so. In a family trained from the cradle to hide everything behind a still face, that openness may have been the hardest thing of all to be near, and also the most precious. It is easy to see why the polished elder brother could not bear it. It is easy to see why the nurse could never let it go. John's own inner world can only be guessed at now, but the guessing is worth the effort because he is so easily flattened into a symbol and so rarely allowed to be a person in his own right. Here was a child who had been part of a large and busy family and who was then, gently, moved out to its very edge. He kept the people who mattered most to him, his Lala above all others, and in that he was luckier than a great many children placed as he was. Yet he must have known, in the way children know things without ever being told them, that he had been set apart, that his brothers and his sister were living a different life 2 miles off across the fields, that something about him meant he could not be where they were. Whatever he understood of it, he seems to have met it without bitterness, and to have gone on loving the people in front of him to the last. That may be at once the saddest and the finest thing that can be said of him. The illness, though, kept its own timetable, and by now that timetable was running out. Through the last year, the seizures grew worse and closer together. The gentle rhythm of the farm, the garden and the chickens and the bicycle rides down the Norfolk lanes went on against a rising tide that everyone around the boy could feel gathering. Lala watched it and understood what it meant, for she had watched it for years. The doctors had said from the very beginning that he would not grow up, and the beginning was a long way behind them now, and the boy was 13 years old. The house that had taken him in was about to be asked for the last thing a hiding place is ever asked to give, which is a quiet room in which to die. It would give it on a winter evening in the January of 1919, and in a single night, the small household that had gathered itself around one child would lose the whole reason it had ever existed. Chapter 7. The night the house went silent. On a January evening in 1919, the seizures came one final time, and by 5:30 the little household had lost the whole reason it existed. The date was the 18th of January. The boy suffered a severe seizure, worse than the many hundreds that had come before it, and this time he did not come back from it. He died in his sleep, at Wood Farm, at about 5:30 in the evening, in the house that had been his home through the last years of his short life. He was 13 years old. The doctors who had warned, almost a decade before, that he would never reach manhood had been proved right at the very last. The long waiting that the household had lived with since the day it first formed was, in a single quiet moment, over. It fell to Charlotte Bill to carry the news. She had been with him at the end, as she had been with him through everything, and it was she who went to tell Queen Mary that her youngest son was dead. One can only imagine that errand, the nurse who had raised the boy walking to the mother who had borne him, to say the thing both of them had long known was coming, and neither could ever truly have been ready to hear. Whatever passed between the two women in that moment is not recorded and is not ours to invent. What is recorded is the Queen's response in the days that followed, set down in her own hand, and it is not the response that the coldest version of this story would lead you to expect. Queen Mary wrote of her son's death in terms of mercy. She called it a great release for the poor, troubled little spirit, and wrote that she would miss the dear child very much indeed. These are careful, contained words, the words of a woman shaped by her time and her position, taught from birth to keep her feelings behind a still face. But the grief in them is real, and so is the love, and so is the exhaustion of a mother who has watched her child suffer for years from a distance the customs of her world forced upon her. Now the suffering had ended, and she felt at once the sorrow of the loss and the mercy of its gentle manner. It is possible to read coldness into the bare fact that he died 2 miles from where she slept. It is not possible, reading her own words, to say that she did not care. There is a strange dignity in the manner of it that deserves to be named plainly. The boy did not die in a hospital ward among strangers. He did not die in the glare of a public that had been taught to pity him. He died in his own bed, in a house he knew, in the care of the woman who had loved him longest, with the fields he had cycled lying quiet in the winter dark beyond the window. For all the sorrow of a life cut off at 13, that is not the worst way for a suffering child to go. The same distance that had kept him from the world also spared him its stare at the very end. Wood Farm gave him a private death, and in an age with so little else to offer him, a private death was not a small thing. And then the short procession to the church, and the Norfolk earth, and the stone. He was laid to rest close to the great house he had been kept away from in life, gathered back at the last into the family that had sent him out to the farm. The parish knew, the household knew. Beyond them, very few people knew anything at all, and that was how the family preferred it. In the weeks that followed, the rooms at Wood Farm were closed up and turned to other uses, and the boy who had filled them with chickens and bicycles and blurted truths passed out of the daily life of the estate. He did not pass out of every heart. One woman carried him with her to the end of her own long life. The family, given the same years, chose to travel lighter, and it is in that choice, far more than in the move to the farm, that the real coldness of the story lies. The funeral was small and quiet, as befitted a boy the wider world had barely been told existed. On the 21st of January, 3 days after his death, John was buried in the churchyard of St. Mary Magdalene at Sandringham, the parish church of the estate, within sight of the very world he had been born into and then set gently apart from. There was no great occasion of state, no lying in state, no nation drawn into mourning, for the nation had been told almost nothing of him while he lived. He was laid in the same Norfolk ground he had walked and gardened and cycled across, close to the family that had sent him to the farm, and there he has lain ever since, a small grave that most visitors to Sandringham walk past today without any idea whose name is cut into the stone. With his burial, Wood Farm fell silent. The household that had formed itself around the boy had no further reason to exist, and one by one its small routines simply stopped. Lala's charge was gone. The garden was his no longer. The chickens, the bicycle, the visits from Winifred, the plot his grandmother had made, All of the gentle machinery of a hidden childhood ran down at once, and the house that had taken in a living, laughing boy became, for a time, no more than an empty farmhouse at the edge of a very large estate. It had done the first of its quiet jobs. It had held a child the family could not show the world, had given him a handful of gentle years and a peaceful death, and had then let him go into the churchyard down the road. The cruelest turn in the whole story came afterwards, and it came not in the house at all, but in the memory of the family, which now set about, slowly and thoroughly, the work of forgetting that the boy had ever lived. Chapter 8. The Prince Who Was Edited Out. The boy who had lived and died at the farm was quietly removed from the family's story, as though the house had swallowed him whole. This is the part of the tale that most looks like shame, and it happened after John was safely in the ground, when he could no longer be an embarrassment to anyone, and could no longer be loved by anyone either, except the nurse, who would not let him go. In the years and the decades that followed his death, the youngest son of King George V was, in effect, edited out of the family record. He slipped from the official memory as completely as he had slipped from the public eye, and the two disappearances together are what have given this whole story its lasting shadow. The signs of it are small and telling. In the family trees drawn up in later years, the ones that set out the descent of the royal house for the public and the history books, John was often simply left off, as though the sixth child had never been born at all. When the family gathered to mark the Silver Jubilee of the King and Queen in 1935, a great public celebration of their reign, the dead boy had no place in the commemorations. For a long stretch of the 20th century, most people in Britain had no idea that George V and Queen Mary had ever had a sixth child, let alone that he had lived out his last years and died in a farmhouse on the Sandringham estate. He had become the lost prince in the most literal sense. The record had closed over him. It is worth sitting for a moment with how strange that is, because it cuts to the heart of what Wood Farm is. A family that keeps 20,000 acres, that owns palaces and castles, that stands at the very centre of the national story, found it easier to behave as though one of its own children had not existed than to hold his memory in the light. The house had hidden him in life. The silence hid him in death. And the silence was arguably the colder act of the two, because the boy at the farm had at least been loved and cared for by the people around him, while the boy in the family record was simply erased, tidied away, made to vanish from the shape of the dynasty so that the shape should look unbroken and clean. That erasure is the true root of the modern charge of heartlessness. When people in later years learned that there had been a hidden prince, and that he had been dropped from the family trees and left out of the celebrations, they drew the obvious conclusion. A family that erases a child, they reasoned, must have been ashamed of him. And so the story hardened into its darkest form, the tale of a boy locked away and then deliberately forgotten by relatives who could not bear the stain of him. Whether or not that fairly describes how he was treated in life, it describes with painful accuracy how he was treated once he was dead, and the two have been tangled together in the public mind ever since. He was recovered in the end, and it took the better part of a century. In the year 2003, the television drama that told his story brought him back into the light, and a nation that had forgotten him met him again, the sweet and difficult boy who had lived and died at the farm on the edge of the estate. The recovery was real, and it was moving, and it carried its own frame of shame along with it, so that the boy came back to public memory already dressed as a victim of his family's coldness. However one judges that frame, the drama did one plain good thing. It made the lost prince unlosable again. It put him back into the story his family had quietly written him out of. One thing the erasure could never touch was the grave. While the family quietly tidied the boy out of its written record, the small stone in the churchyard at St. Mary Magdalene stayed exactly where it had been set, close to the great house, quiet under the Norfolk weather. A record can be redrawn. A family tree can be printed with a name left off it. A grave is a harder thing to unmake, and John's remained where it was, a plain marker in a country churchyard that outlasted every attempt to smooth him out of the story. And there was one living record the family could not edit at all. For as long as Charlotte Bill drew breath, and she lived until 1964, the boy was remembered by someone who had loved him, kept alive on a mantelpiece, and in a note folded carefully away among her things. The official memory of the dynasty closed over him. The private memory of one faithful woman would not close at all. Between those two records, the cold one of the family and the warm one of the nurse, the whole argument of his short life is written in miniature. The people who found it easier to forget, and the servant who found it impossible. It is tempting to be very hard on the family for the forgetting, and it is worth resisting that temptation, at least a little. The quiet erasure of an inconvenient death was hardly unique to this house or this dynasty. Grief in that world was a private matter, and a disabled child who had died young was, by the harsh arithmetic of the age, a thing to be mourned in silence and then set aside. What makes John's case linger in the mind is its royalty. It was played out at the very summit of a society that watched its monarchy with unblinking attention, and so it was preserved, in the end, for everyone to argue over. Through all of this, the house itself stood where it had always stood, 2 miles from the great house, quiet at the edge of the fields. It had done its first work and lost its first occupant, and the small household that had gathered around the boy had scattered. For a while, the rooms where he had lived held no one of any note at all. The farmhouse that had briefly been the home of a king's son settled back toward the ordinary life it had led before him, the plain life of a building on a working estate. It would be many years before the family reached for it again, and when it did, it would come not to hide a child, but simply to escape, and the house would enjoy the happiest and most ordinary chapter of its long and peculiar life. Chapter 9. The years the farm was just a farm. For half a century, the most discreet house on the estate went back to being what it had always been, a place to work and to live in quietly. Wood Farm had begun its life as a genuine working farmhouse, one building among the many that made the Sandringham estate a real and productive stretch of Norfolk country. And after John, it returned to something close to that plain purpose. There were no princes in its rooms and no secrets in its walls. There was only the slow rhythm of an estate that farmed its land and bred its horses and let its fields to tenants, and the small brick house sat within that rhythm, unremarkable and unremarked, for a long stretch of years. Then, in the second half of the 20th century, the family discovered it again and fell in love with the very plainness that had once made it useful for hiding a child. From the 1960s onward, the wider royal family began to use Wood Farm for itself, and the reason was exactly the reason the house had always offered. It could be lived in without the enormous machinery that every other royal residence demanded. There was no need for a great staff, no need for the full apparatus of a court, no need for any of the ceremony that made ordinary life impossible at the palaces. At Wood Farm, the family could simply stop and be quiet, and be, for a while, almost like anybody else. The details of that ordinariness have become a small legend in themselves, and they are worth setting down because they are so unlike the popular picture of royal life. At Wood Farm, the staff were not required to wear uniforms. The family lived informally, in a way that would have been unthinkable at Sandringham House or Buckingham Palace, with their liveried footmen and their rigid order of precedence. The Queen herself, it is said, cooked and did household tasks during her stays at the farm, something simply impossible in a fully staffed royal residence where a monarch is attended at every turn. Here the machinery of monarchy was switched off at the door. Here a queen could boil a kettle and wash a plate and sit by a fire in an old cardigan, and no one would think it strange. There is something quietly revealing in that appetite for the ordinary, and it runs right through the 20th century royal story. For all the grandeur of the palaces, or perhaps because of it, the family developed a deep hunger for places where the grandeur could be laid down, where log fires and plain food and the absence of servants offered a taste of the ordinary life the rest of the country simply lived. Sandringham's smaller houses fed that hunger, and Wood Farm fed it best of all. It was the purest expression of a very human wish, the wish of people who are always on show to have, somewhere, a room where no one is watching. The plainest house on the estate gave them that room. And yet here is the thing that gives the whole warm chapter its chill. The very qualities that made Wood Farm such a beloved escape, its distance, its plainness, its total lack of ceremony, its position 2 miles from the big house and out of the public eye, were precisely the qualities that had once made it a place to hide a sick child, and would one day make it a place to hide a disgraced man. The house did not change, only the use changed. The same distance that gave a queen the freedom to wash her own dishes had given a lost prince his exile, and would give a fallen brother his refuge from the cameras. The instrument was neutral. It served concealment and it served escape with the same quiet ease, because at bottom, concealment and escape are the same thing seen from 2 different sides. To picture those quiet decades, you have to picture the estate at its ordinary work, because that is what surrounded the little house through all the years it held no secret at all. Sandringham was, and remains, a real farm on an enormous scale, more than half of its land let out to tenants who worked it season by season, with studs breeding horses and a fruit farm, and all the plain machinery of a great agricultural estate. Wood Farm sat inside that working world as one modest building among many, its rooms lived in and its fields tended, giving away nothing of the sorrow they had once contained. A stranger passing along the lane in those years would have seen only a farmhouse. There is a deeper point folded into all this informality, and it reaches well beyond one family's taste in holidays. A monarchy is a performance that never ends. The people at its centre are watched from the cradle to the grave, their faces on the coins and the stamps, their smallest gestures studied and reported and remembered. To live in that way is to lose something ordinary that everyone else takes for granted, the simple freedom of being unobserved. Wood Farm gave that freedom back, in small doses, for a few days at a time, and the family drank it gratefully. The plainest house on the whole estate held the single rarest luxury it had to offer, which was privacy. And so, the house lived a double life across the century, without anyone ever quite naming it aloud. In the bad years, it was a place of concealment. In the good years, it was a place of escape. The family moved between the 2 uses without seeming to notice that they were, at bottom, the same use, wearing different clothes. A queen washing a plate at the farm sink and a lost prince hidden in an upstairs room were 2 faces of one plain truth about the building, that its whole gift was the gift of not being seen. For a long stretch of happy decades, only the kindly face was on show. The other one waited. For decades, though, the darker side of that truth stayed hidden, and Wood Farm was simply the family's favourite bolt hole, a place of happy and unbuttoned days. Children ran in its garden. Guests came for the shooting. The house that had known such sorrow in 1919 knew, across the following decades, a great deal of ordinary happiness, and it is important to give that happiness its due before the story turns back toward the dark. The people who loved Wood Farm in these years loved it honestly, and it repaid them. It was the one place they could be least like royalty, and they came to it again and again, generation after generation, each one falling for the same plain magic in turn. Chapter 10. The Favourite Escape with an Older Purpose. It became the house where they could stop being royal, and every generation fell for it in turn. The list of those who loved Wood Farm reads like a roll call of the modern royal family, and each of them came to it for the same reason, the promise of a few days out of the glare. Here, the heir to the throne learned to treat the place as a private refuge. Here, a future princess stayed on the edge of the most watched engagement of her age. Here, the couple who would one day be Prince and Princess of Wales came in the early, tender days of their courtship. The plain farmhouse 2 miles from the big house gathered them all in, and asked nothing of them but that they enjoy its quiet. Prince Charles, the present king, was among the first of the modern family to make the house his own. In his college years he held shooting parties at Wood Farm, and he kept the habit into adulthood, using the place as a bolt hole, a retreat from the pressures of a life lived almost entirely in public. For a young man, raised to be watched from birth, the value of such a place is hard to overstate. It was somewhere he could shoot and walk and sit by the fire without an audience, somewhere the future did not press quite so hard, somewhere the plain rooms asked nothing of him but that he be himself. The house that had once hidden a prince now sheltered one who simply needed to breathe. It was to Wood Farm, too, that a young Diana came, in the days before the engagement, that would change her life and the life of the monarchy forever. She stayed at the farm during a shooting weekend, in the period before the world knew what was coming, when the courtship was still, for a few last weeks, a private thing. There is a particular poignancy in that, given everything that followed, given how completely her life would afterwards be lived in the full and merciless glare of the world's attention. For one quiet weekend, she was a guest at a plain farmhouse on a Norfolk estate, out of sight, unhounded, before the cameras found her, and never again let her go. Wood Farm gave her, too, its brief gift of invisibility. The pattern held into the next generation. Catherine, who would become Princess of Wales, visited Wood Farm early in her long relationship with Prince William, in the years when the two of them were building a life together, away from as much scrutiny as they could manage. In time, once they were married, the couple hosted their own shooting parties from the house, taking up the same tradition that Charles had begun a generation before. The farmhouse passed down through the family, not as a burden or a duty, but as a pleasure, a shared secret, the one address where the most famous family in the world could close the door and simply be at home. For decades, this was what Wood Farm meant to them, and the meaning was entirely warm. Think for a moment about what invisibility meant to people such as these. For most of us, the state of being unseen is the ordinary weather of life, so common we never once remark on it. For the royal family, it was, and is, among the rarest things they own. To walk into a shop unrecognized, to sit in a garden without a long lens trained on the hedge, to make some small mistake without the whole country reading of it the next morning, these were freedoms the family almost never tasted. Wood Farm handed them out at the door. That is why they loved it so deeply, and why they returned to it down the generations, each one discovering afresh the plain miracle of a place where nobody was looking. What passed down through the family was not the title to the house, for the estate itself held that, but a feeling for it, an inherited fondness handed from one generation to the next, like a favourite old story. The father, who had used it as a young man, brought his own sons into the same low rooms. The habits repeated themselves. The shooting parties formed and reformed with new faces gathered around the same fires. A house loved in that way becomes almost a member of the family, woven quietly into the memories of childhood and courtship, and all the ordinary passages of a life. To the modern royal family, Wood Farm was exactly that. A familiar and beloved presence, the keeper of their happiest and least guarded hours. There is a poignancy, too, in how completely the happy family forgot the house's first tenant, even as they loved his refuge. The children who played in the garden did not know that a boy had once kept his chickens on the same ground. The guests who came for the shooting did not think of the small household that had once waited here for a death. The lost prince had been erased so thoroughly that even in the house where he had lived and died, his memory did not trouble the people who came after him. They loved Wood Farm freely and lightly, without a shadow on it, because the shadow had been so carefully swept away. That gentle forgetting was of a piece with everything else the house had ever done. It kept its secrets even from the people who loved it best. That warmth is real, and it deserves to be honoured rather than explained away, because it is part of the truth of the house. Wood Farm was loved. It gave comfort and ease and ordinary happiness to people who had precious little of any of those things in their public lives. But the warmth is also what makes the rest of the story so unsettling, because the very same features that made the house such a haven were the features that fitted it for a darker use. A place perfect for escaping the world's eye is, by the same measure, a place perfect for keeping someone from the world's eye. The line between a refuge and a hiding place is thin, and it is drawn not by the house, but by the reason a person is sent there. For most of these happy decades, the reason was simple pleasure. But the older reason had not gone away. It had only gone quiet, and it was waiting. And in time, the house would be asked to do its oldest work once more. Chapter 11. The Prince Who Chose the Plain House. In the summer of 2017, after 65 years of public duty, the most restless man in the family chose to withdraw to the smallest house on the estate. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, had spent almost his whole adult life at the Queen's side, a step behind her through a lifetime of public occasions, a consort who had made a career of duty and had chafed, all the while, against the loss of his own freedom that the role demanded. In August of that year, he retired from public life, and when he did, he made a choice that says everything about the man. He did not retire to a palace. He retired to Wood Farm. The choice was pure Philip, and it turned the whole meaning of the house on its head. For the first time, the person who came to live in the plain farmhouse 2 miles from the great house was not sent there at all. He chose it, freely and gladly, and he chose it for exactly the reasons that had once made it a place of exile. He wanted the distance. He wanted the plainness. He wanted to be out past the woods, away from the cameras, master at last of his own time. What had been imposed on a helpless child as a kind of banishment, this fierce and independent old man claimed for himself as a kind of freedom. The same walls, the same 2 miles, the same quiet, turned in an instant from a cage into a refuge, because the one thing that had changed was everything, which is to say, the person inside had chosen to be there. He made the house his own, in a way none of its earlier occupants had. He had a new kitchen fitted. He reworked the bedrooms. He hung the walls with his own watercolour paintings, the fruit of a lifelong hobby, so that the plain farmhouse became a gallery of one man's private eye. He kept only a small staff and no crowd of courtiers, and he prized above all what an old friend described as being master of his own time and living away from cameras. He read, He painted. He had friends to stay. He busied himself with the small practical improvements that a man of his restless energy could never leave alone. After a lifetime of standing behind, of walking 2 paces to the rear, of subordinating his own considerable will to the demands of the crown, he had at last a place that was simply his, run to his own taste, and no one else's. He threw himself, too, into the life of the estate around him, and one small venture became a family joke, and then a family triumph. Philip had long wanted to grow truffles, those rare and costly fungi that fetch extraordinary prices, and he had established a truffle plantation on the estate. For years, it produced nothing at all. The whole enterprise became a standing joke among his family, the Duke and his stubborn, fruitless truffle beds. And then, in 2018, after all the failure and all the teasing, the plantation finally yielded its Perigord black truffles, the so-called black gold, and the old man had his victory at last. It is a small story, but it is a human one, and it belongs to these years at the farm, the years of a man happily busy in his own domain. The choice mattered so much because of the man who made it. Prince Philip was famously his own person, restless, sharp-tongued, impatient with fuss, a man who had walked a step behind his wife for the whole of his adult life. He had done the duty, decade upon decade, without ever quite losing the private sense that the duty had cost him something of his own. For such a man, the freedom of Wood Farm was more than a small comfort. It was a kind of restitution, a handing back at the very end of things, of the independent self he had folded away at the beginning. In the plain rooms of the farm, he was, for the first time in a very long life, answerable to nobody but himself. And that is what makes the symmetry with the lost prince so haunting, and worth setting down plainly before the story turns to its close. 2 occupants of one small house, separated by 100 years, could hardly have stood further apart. One was a child, powerless, placed at the farm because his illness left the family no kinder course it was willing to take. The other was a grown man of iron will, who might have commanded any roof in the kingdom and chose this one instead. Yet the house did precisely the same thing for both of them. It gave them distance from the world, and quiet, and a life lived out of the public sight. For the boy, that distance was a sorrow he had not asked for. For the old man, it was a gift he had reached out and taken. The walls themselves could not tell the difference between the two. Only the hearts inside them could. Through it all, he lived largely apart from the Queen, and this was by design and not by estrangement. She remained, for much of the time, at Windsor and at Buckingham Palace, where the business of the monarchy required her. He remained at Wood Farm, in his plain rooms with his watercolours and his truffles, content in a way he had rarely been allowed to be. They had spent a lifetime side by side in the most public partnership in the world, and now, in the last chapter, they lived a good deal of it in different houses, she at the centre of things, and he out at the quiet edge. It suited them, by every account, and it set up the strange and moving symmetry that sits at the very heart of this house's story, the 2 princes and the one farmhouse. A boy who could not choose, placed at Wood Farm and unable to leave it. An old man who could choose anything, choosing Wood Farm above every palace he might have had. The same small house at the edge of the same great estate, holding at the start of the century a child hidden away, and at the end of a long life a prince set free. Chapter 12. The house he retired to, but did not die in. The title of this story says he spent his last years at the farm, and honesty demands one correction before the end. It is a correction worth making carefully, because the truth of a life should not be bent even by a good story. And the truth here is both simple and easily misremembered. Prince Philip did retire to Wood Farm. He did spend the first years of his retirement there, from the summer of 2017, living in his plain rooms with his watercolours and his truffles, largely apart from the Queen, for the best part of 3 years. To that extent, the title is fair and true. But the very last chapter of his life was not written at the farm at all, and the record has to say so plainly. The change came with the world's change. In the spring of 2020, the coronavirus pandemic swept across Britain and the globe, and the ordinary arrangements of every life, including the most royal, were suddenly undone. Prince Philip left Wood Farm. He went to Windsor Castle to isolate with the Queen. The two of them shut away together for safety through the long months of the crisis, an old married couple of more than 70 years, seeing out the strangest season of their lives behind the walls of the castle. He did not return to the farm to live. From that point on, he was based at Windsor, at his wife's side once more, at the very end as at the beginning. Early in 2021, his health began to fail in earnest. He spent about a month in hospital, undergoing a procedure for a heart condition and being treated for an infection, a long stay for a man approaching 100 years of age. He came through it, and he came home. But the reserves of even so robust a constitution were running down at last. On the 9th of April, 2021, Prince Philip died at Windsor Castle at the age of 99. The cause recorded was simply old age. He died in the castle, with the monarchy he had served all around him, and not in the plain farmhouse 2 miles from the great house at Sandringham. This distinction matters, and not merely as a point of accuracy, though accuracy is reason enough. It matters because it tells the truth about what Wood Farm was to him and what it was not. The farm was not his deathbed. It was his freedom. It was the place he chose when he was finally allowed to choose, the setting of the last good years when he was master of his own time, painting and pottering and pleasing himself. When the end drew near, he was where a consort of his generation would be expected to be, beside the Queen, within the walls of a royal castle, at the centre of the institution, rather than out at its quiet edge. The house had given him the best of his final years. It did not claim his final hours. There is something fitting in where the pandemic sent him, even as it took him from the house he loved. For more than 70 years, he had been the Queen's consort, the one constant at her side through every storm the reign had weathered. When the world shut its doors in 2020, the two of them shut theirs together, and the man who had spent his retirement out at the quiet edge came back to the centre, to Windsor, to his wife. Whatever the farm had given him of freedom, the castle gave him, at the last, the daily company of the person he had stood beside for a lifetime. He had chosen a kind of solitude for his final years. The pandemic, in its blunt way, handed him back companionship for his final months. The neat version of the story is easy to tell, and it is false, and the falseness is worth correcting. In the neat version, the old prince simply fades away in the farmhouse he had made his own, and the tale closes with a gentle symmetry. The plain fact refuses to fit it. He died at Windsor Castle in April of 2021, at 99 years of age, and any telling of Wood Farm that blurs the point does the man a quiet disservice. The house gave him a great deal. It gave him the freedom of his last good years, the painting and the truffles and the reclaimed time. It did not give him his death, and it has no need to. What it truly gave him is remarkable enough without the embellishment. So the honest shape of it is this. For the boy John, Wood Farm was where life ended, a quiet room in which a suffering child slipped away. For the old prince, Wood Farm was where a public life was laid down and a private one taken up, a place of watercolours and truffles and reclaimed time. And then, when the true end came, he left it behind for the castle and the company of his wife. One prince the house held to the last. The other it set free for a season, and then released to a grander ending. The title of this story catches the spirit of his years there, and the correction catches the fact of his death, and both belong in an honest telling of the house and the men who passed through it. Chapter 13. The house is still working. 107 years after a sick child was moved out past the woods, the family reached for the same small house again. The story of Wood Farm might have ended as a piece of history, a tale of one Edwardian tragedy and one modern retirement, closed and complete. It has not ended, because in our own time the house has been asked once more to do the oldest of its quiet jobs, and the asking has happened as recently as the present year. The instrument that hid a boy a century ago and freed a prince in 2017 was taken up yet again, and this time, to hold a man the world had turned against. In February of 2026, Andrew, once the Duke of York, was moved to Wood Farm. He had given up his lease on Royal Lodge, the house that had been his home, and he had been stripped of the royal style he was born to, his titles and honours fallen away in the wreckage of scandal. Amid the fallout from the release of documents connected to the Epstein affair, the family needed the man at the centre of the storm to be somewhere out of the public eye, and the place it reached for was the plain farmhouse 2 miles from Sandringham House. He was moved there while renovations were carried out at the nearby Marsh Farm, where he was expected to settle. And so, more than a century after the lost prince, the same small door on the edge of the estate opened to receive another member of the family the world was not to see. What has followed belongs to the news rather than to history, and it should be told plainly and without relish. Not long after his move, Andrew was arrested at Wood Farm on suspicion of misconduct in public office, a matter that remained under investigation. The details of that case are for the courts and the papers, not for this story, and the point here is not the scandal, but the setting. Whatever he is finally found to have done or not done, the striking thing, for the purpose of this house, is where the family put him while the crisis was managed. They did not put him at the centre of things. They sent him out to the edge, to the quiet house past the shooting woods, exactly as their forebears had done with an ailing boy in the reign of George V. The parallel is uncomfortable, and it is meant to be, though it must be handled with care, because the cases could hardly be more different in their substance. John was an innocent child, hidden through no fault of his own, sent to the farm by an illness he did not choose. Andrew is a grown man at the centre of grave and public allegations, moved to the farm amid a scandal of an entirely different order. To set them side by side is not to equate their stories or their deserving. It is only to notice the house and the reflex, and the fact that across all the vast distance between a sick Edwardian child and a disgraced modern brother, the family's instinct in a crisis of visibility has been precisely the same. When someone cannot be seen, they go to Wood Farm. The plain mechanics of it, stripped of the headlines, are simple enough. A man at the centre of a national scandal has to live somewhere, and the family that must manage the damage has to decide where. It did not choose a townhouse in London or a wing of a working palace. It chose the farthest, quietest, most private house on its most private estate. A building screened by woods and fields and miles of Norfolk, watched over by the estate's own people, far from any street a photographer could lawfully stand in. Every quality that had once made Wood Farm a gentle place to keep a sick child made it now a practical place to keep a disgraced one. The requirements turned out to be the same: distance, privacy, ground the family controlled on every side. And so, the wheel comes round, The house that received a boy in the reign of one king now shelters the brother of another, and the century that lies between them seems to collapse to nothing at all when you stand at the gate and understand what the house is for. The faces change. The scandals change. The plain brick farmhouse on the edge of the estate does not change at all. That is what makes the house so quietly remarkable. It is not a ruin or a relic. It is a working instrument still, performing in the present tense the function it has performed for more than 100 years. As this story is told, the plain brick farmhouse on the edge of Sandringham is once again home to a member of the royal family that the wider world is not meant to look at too closely. The cameras gather at the estate gates. The man stays out past the woods. The house does what it has always done, which is to put distance between the family and the gaze of the public, and to do it so quietly that most people never think of the house at all. It has outlived kings and consorts and scandals, and it is still, today, at its old and discreet work. Chapter 14. What the Plain House Knows. Turn off the road at Sandringham, drive 2 miles past the shooting woods, and the house is still there, still doing its quiet job. It looks like nothing. It has always looked like nothing, and that has always been the point of it. 5 bedrooms of red brick, a scatter of outbuildings, a view over the marshes toward the sea, and a silence that has closed, in its time, over a dying child, a retiring prince, and a fallen brother. To stand in front of Wood Farm is to stand in front of one of the strangest buildings in the royal story, a house whose whole importance lies in its refusal to be important, whose power has nothing to do with grandeur at all. And that is the first thing the house knows, the thing it has been teaching for more than 100 years. The power of Wood Farm was never the power of grandeur. It was the power to make a person unseen. A palace gathers the eye. This house turns it away. In a family that owns some of the most watched buildings on earth, the most useful house of all has turned out to be the one that no one looks at. The plain farmhouse where a person can be set down, out past the woods, and quietly lost to view. The great houses display the monarchy. This small one hides the parts of it that cannot be displayed. Both are instruments of the same institution, and it is an open question which of the two has done the harder work. The second thing the house knows is how little the family's deepest instinct has changed. Look across the span of it, from that first winter to the present year. A monarchy that has been transformed almost beyond recognition in that time, that has weathered abdication and war and the slow retreat of deference, that has modernized and apologized and reinvented itself for a watching world, has kept one old reflex perfectly intact. When a member of the family cannot be shown, the answer is the same as it was a century ago. Move them to the edge of the private land, out past the shooting grounds, 2 miles from the great house, and let the quiet do its work. Coronations come and go. Wood Farm endures, because the need it answers endures, and that need is as old as the idea of a family that must always be seen. The third thing the house knows is the hardest, and it is the thing that should stay with anyone who hears this story. The same act can be a mercy or a cruelty, and from this distance it is not always possible to tell which. Moving a dying boy to a gentle farmhouse, with the nurse who loved him and a garden made by his grandmother, can be read as tenderness or as exile, and honest history has to hold both readings at once and refuse to choose. Giving an old prince the plain house he longed for was plainly a kindness. Sending a disgraced man out past the woods was plainly a convenience. The house served all three, and it judged none of them. It only opened its door and took them in, and kept its silence, and waited for the next arrival. It is natural to look for a lesson in all of this, some tidy verdict on a family or an age, and the house quietly declines to offer one. It is only a building. It did not choose its occupants or their fates. It simply stood where it was put, at the far edge of a great estate, and received whoever the family could not keep at the centre. Yet in its very blankness, it holds up a kind of mirror, and what it shows is an old and human truth about power, that the grandest families have always needed a plain place to put what they cannot show, and that the history written in the great houses is never quite the whole of it. Some of that history is written instead in the small ones, in a farmhouse 2 miles down the track that most people will never see. Perhaps that is why it lingers in the mind, this least grand of all the royal houses. Somewhere in the churchyard at St. Mary, Magdalene, a small stone still marks the boy who died at the farm, and somewhere among a nurse's belongings, years ago, a note was found in a child's hand telling her that he was loved. The grandeur of Sandringham will draw the visitors and fill the guidebooks. But the truest story on the whole estate is kept 2 miles away, in a plain brick house that was built to be overlooked and has spent a century keeping the family's most difficult people out of sight. Turn off the road, drive past the shooting woods, and it is still there, waiting, as it has always waited, for the next person the world is not allowed to see. If these are the stories that keep you here, subscribe and stay with me for the next one. And tell me below what you make of this one. Was Wood Farm an act of mercy or an act of exile? And can you truly tell the difference? I read every comment, and I would like to know where you stand.